And you need trailers, and obviously for the past 2 years, there's been problems getting them. And being a multimodal asset like JB Hunt, you can't just plug in a 53-foot dry van. You got your, 40-foot containers and your other various ones. And so, the similar situation, predictability for Wabash. It's a win-win for them because depending upon how the economy is, you order more or you order less, depends on how much money you have. So, this is a continuation of an effort we've been seeing ongoing where trailer manufacturers are coming up with more unique ways to smooth out the demand curve, so to speak, in order to have more predictable, profits.
And so speaking about that demand curve, do you see this still coming as a product of current economic environments, or is this something that really kind of makes sense in any kind of economic environment?
You could normally, given the backlog and the issues with production right now, there's a lot of pent-up demand. Now, OEM manufacturers, whether they're Class 8s or trailers, they're more familiar with the boom and bust cycle. But generally, if you have a fleet and a 3-to-1 truck-to-trailer ratio with an enterprise carrier, you're always going to need to replace them anyway. And then you sell the crappier ones that have aged to smaller carriers, and then they incur the costs, and the circle of life continues. So yeah, it's a little bit more of business is the same, but the difference is, we're seeing more like brokerages with power only making deals with trailer companies making more deals kind of like instead of your traditional plug and play where trailer manufacturers are like, look, I don't care after it goes off the lot, it's your problem. Now trailer manufacturers are thinking, oh, I can potentially try and be more involved with this cycle, like sending your kid off to boarding school and you decide to visit him once every month instead of forgetting about him for a whole semester.
And when we're looking at this scenario, do we see any other potential deals that's similar to this, or do you think this is really kind of an individual situation for both of them? It's kind of one-off and it makes all the sense in the world, or is it something that we're going to see more of potentially?
I would expect to see more deals. I mean, looking at JB Hunt as well, given its footprint, you would see that it makes more sense why they would go first because they want more chassis and been making deals with intermodal plays, which is a growth avenue for trucking. Ironically enough for trucking, once you have a large enough OTR fleet, you don't want to keep building that because of the boom-bust cycle. So you go into something where it's more of a pain in the neck to deal with, like intermodal operations, make a deal with a railroad. So, Schneider has a large presence, Hub Group has a large presence, intermodal play. I'd expect to see more of that first. And then eventually companies like, your Werners, your Heartlands, your US Expresses and stuff, having those kinds of deals makes more sense for them as well, because then when you're looking at your financial reports, you have more predictability as well. There's no oopsie daisies, there's no surprises. Oh crap, I need to buy another like 3,000 more because the hubs are breaking on this model. I knew that one time where certain models of trailers would combust. So it's important to have a very, level, even-headed approach to how you replace your equipment.
And when we're looking at the freight market, do you see that we've hit a bottom potentially in the freight market, or do you think that we're starting to kind of moderate at its flat line, or some uptrend here in the coming months?
This is the fun part. Everyone's talking about the NFL playoffs. I talk about economics predictions because, trucking is so impacted by that. Don't be a sailor unless you know which way the wind blows. So, lots of predictions. A fun one, Craig Fuller put on social media, trying to find the bottom. FreightWaves Sonar data was talking about how, we noticed in Sonar was kind of running across and just kind of skirting and bouncing a little bit on some of our spot rates. And so, the predictions are currently that it's either going to be between the end of Q1 of this year or the end of the first half of this year, depending upon who you ask. Larger brokerages, larger carriers, larger incumbents are expecting it to be more of the middle of the year. And some of our FreightWaves survey data, smaller ones and more nimble operations are expecting things to get a little more rosier in the springtime. So it depends on who you ask. At the end of the day, you know this more than I do. Retail consumption, durable versus non-durable. What's the spend look like? How's our container import situation? Ironically enough, people ask me in trucking, what should I watch? Pay attention to the economists, folks, because the more we buy, the more it translates eventually downstream into truckload orders.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we're looking at what's happening with consumers, their ability to make purchases. We're definitely seeing a lot of credit card utilization really start to continue to skyrocket. We're definitely seeing inflationary pressures continue to moderate, even though we saw downward movement in energy and used vehicles. But there's just so many factors at play for the consumers that really kind of put a bit of a headwind really on their ability to make these purchases. So I think that's a great point there. When we're looking at, I think, towards the end of the year. I think that's just like this big black hole that no one wants to touch right now. But do you see anything that could be a potential wild card factor going into the remainder or the second half of the year that no one's really talking about right now?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good one. So I'm gonna go two options. The first one that magically pops in my head is energy. Energy prices, the price of diesel. We're seeing downward movements, of course, but this could provide. When we talk about the destruction of capacity for rates to improve. If fuel prices continue to stay higher, we see that capacity leave the market more. If fuel prices decide to go lower, they're going to hang around a little bit longer just because of some of these things like sunken cost fallacy and other psychological behaviors. I ain't giving up my business just yet, folks. We're going to hang in there even though I'm up at 105 OR. By that point, you don't even know what your OR is. You're just in it to win it. But, you'd be surprised how long a trucking company can last. Some folks, is like a good one can go out after a month, but if you have thousands of assets, you can just plug and play. Things that folks wouldn't really expect. The overall macro conditions, that's the one that always gets me because it just feels weird. We see all these tech layoffs, we see all this transition, but there's still a lot of demand. So, I would say the things that people were probably not expecting, geopolitical. What happens with China reopening? Will that impact diesel prices? What happens if Russia and Ukraine continues to go into 2023? Will that have an impact on our demand? And it's silly, people would ask me, they say, well, you're the trucking expert. Why should I care about this? Well, a lot of these states produce things that we need, whether it's the phosphates, fertilizers, urea, which goes into the particulates and stuff that actually filters out our NOx. There's a lot of things on the peripheral of the supply chain we probably want to pay attention to just because it's going to impact it. But I think the biggest surprise is going to be where the heck are the owner operators and why can't I figure out how many of them have died yet? Because, we talk about bloodbaths and stuff. We talk about this leaving the market. It's tricky. I can't just go on the FMCSA's website and pull up the dead pool. I can't just see how many of you disappeared. Oh, let's look at, FMCSA carrier revocations. That just means that, Anthony, you decided to tell the FMCSA, I'm done. That's it. You know what you do normally? You just disappear for a while, you stop paying your insurance, and you sit on your MC, and you sell it to somebody. There's a whole secondary market for used motor carrier numbers. So, so then we'll ask ourselves, all right, so we look at that portion. How else can we find where the owner operators have one? Where's this migration? Pull up publicly traded data. Folks like JB Hunt, Schneider, and them, they gained a few hundred owner operators. So we know a few of them went there, but, trucking is such a fragmented thing that I think that's going to be the big surprise is going to be we're either going to be surprised that not enough of them died, or it turns out way past the fact a lot of them had left earlier than we expected. Right now, the data, it takes a few months to process it. And if you look at jobs, these are owner-operators. These are like 1099s. They don't traditionally show up in the W-2, submit to Uncle Sam, and even if you did, they don't give a crap enough about digging through the data. So trying to find that magic number, we talk about it all the time, but I always tell people when they ask me, you have to approach it from the sides. This rise and flow, it's like trying to predict the tide with a measuring stick or a yardstick. So the extent of owner-operators leaving the market and how this is impacting it is something I think that is going to be extremely important to figure out in 2023, but also extremely difficult.
I think that's a great call out there, and especially with not just owner-operators, but definitely what's going to happen with China. Are we going to see a ton of production come back online? Are we going to see a ton of demand after so many of lockdowns have happened? Russia, I think a big strategy that Putin wants is for people to forget about it happening and just continue to go on with no one really paying attention. So there are all these great factors I think you mentioned that really are going to be at play here. If people want to get more of your content, get more of you in video or even in long-form content newsletter, how can they do that?
Definitely. tv.freightwaves.com/loaded and rolling. We also do every Tuesday and Thursday now. It used to be Wednesday night and Saturday morning, but the powers that be said I have to be responsible. So, Tuesdays and Thursdays between 2 and 3 p.m. As well. And then we're also live every Tuesday at 1 p.m. We're going to have the folks with Werner on today. I think the CIO is coming on, talking about their digital digitalization effort, and that's really fun. Folks should check it out. Should be a really great show. Publicly traded large trucking companies. That's kind of one of my goals for 2023. Speaking of ideas, is to actually get more trucking companies for the trucking expert to talk to. So it's going to be real fun getting a little behind the scenes on how folks do that. It's really fascinating because we hear about it, but we only really hear about it with press releases and really far away. So talking to the people, always really fun. Hopefully we learned something fun today.
Awesome. Well, Thomas, thank you so much for your time today. Looking forward to that episode a little bit later on. Right now, we're going to take a short break, but we'll be right back with more FreightWaves Now.
Like F3, we know what they want is a chance to show off their products, their swag, and make new partnerships that will last until our next FreightWaves event.
But the problem is there are so many industry events, it can be so hard to find the right one to invest your time and energy in. We at FreightWaves take your investment seriously.
Which is why we've brought together thousands of industry professionals in one city over 3 days to showcase all you have to offer.
Because your successful connections at an event like F3 move all of us forward.
Don't believe us?
Join us in June.
Hey everybody, this is Thomas Watson, enterprise trucking carrier expert here at FreightWaves, telling you about my show, Loaded and Rolling. Now, it involves trucking topics for large carriers and even small ones that wish to be large. Anything that impacts trucking, you can get it there. You can catch us every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern on tv.freightwaves.com. We do it live.
And welcome back to FreightWaves Now. It's time for our second check of the weather this morning. And we're finally starting to see a little bit of relief for California after about a week and a half of a deluge of rain there. Let's check it out in Sonar Critical Events. Some places in California have seen well over 300% of their total annual rainfall just in the last week alone. And we're looking at reservoirs being filled up. We are looking at now some really strong impacts from flooding. Roads have been washed out. And even though the rain is starting to taper off, we are just slowly starting to see those impacts come more to light. So let's check it out right now. We do have the radar pulled up, and we can see that for the first time in about a week, there's a lot of dry areas in California, all the way up along the coastline. Still some lingering showers, though, across the central parts of the state, but for the most part, those folks that we have seen for quite a long time really just receiving a lot of that rainfall are finally getting a little bit of a break. We do still have some flood warnings in place, though, as that runoff continues to be a factor. So we've got a flood warning that does include U.S. Highway 101, the Salinas area up to Monterey Bay, and then up in the foothills of the mountains as well before you get over those first mountains and into the I-5 corridor. We do have flood warnings as well. So what we're going to be watching out for is just that continued runoff to cause some roadway erosion, as well as possibly some road closures out there. There are pieces of U.S. State Highway 1, that is the Pacific Coast Highway, that have completely washed away, so that highway is closed in some places. Same thing with U.S. 101, and even Interstate 5 has a couple of places where there are going to be road closures there. So overall, still seeing some traffic impacts, and even though we're expecting a little bit of a break with the weather, we're going to see the atmospheric river ramp up once again coming into the end of the week. We could see just another few days of extended rainfall there. That does it for this look of weather. Finally getting some good news for California, though. We'll talk a little bit more about that coming up later on in the show. Right now, we're going to go ahead and take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to another edition of Check Call, Check Call, Check Call, Check Call. Let's go. Nobody works for free, so why should we be expecting our drivers to? Okay, let's just get it together now. What are some of those proactive steps that you can start taking now? For myself, I would like the Earth to still be here for a little bit longer, but you know, is a hot dog a sandwich?
Oh, okay. Is pizza an open-faced sandwich? It's bread.
I have been ready for this question. I've seen the show.
We're all in this together.
Thanks for making me hungry. Now I want a hot dog.
You're welcome. Catch episodes of Check Call Tuesdays at 12:30 on FreightWaves TV. Keep up with all things Check Call on freightwaves.com/checkcall. See you on the internet.
What does this have to do with freight? Well, I'm glad you asked. People are wondering what's going to happen with inflation. Is there going to be hyperinflation? When is hyperinflation going to be here? When is there going to be inflation? What's going to happen with inflation? Inflation, inflation, inflation.
This is the sexiest topic within the economy right now.
Welcome back to FreightWaves Now. We've got our 3PL expert, Mary O'Connell, on the phone with us to chat a little bit about what it takes to sell to people who maybe you haven't sold to before. Mary, thanks for joining us. You're in the airport right now, so we're glad to be able to get you on.
Anytime, guys. I'm happy to call in and hang out with my favorite people at any location.
So let's talk a little bit about it, right? Maybe you're a broker and you are trying to build up your book of business. Maybe that's your new year, new you goal, right? And you're trying to get a foot in the door with some people that you've never talked to before, you've never sold to before. How do you make a good first impression that is going to last and then eventually get you paid?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be, you always want to start off on a good foot. Everyone says the most important thing is your first impression. So you really want to make sure that, like, when you're calling prospective customers, you really want to make sure that you have done your homework, you've done your research. You know, you're not just calling to say, yeah, I want to move your freight and I'll save you 10% off the top. You want to make sure that you're really, you go in, you know what kind of freight they move, you know what their main commodities are. Bonus points if you even know some of their locations and challenges that they have that commonly occur with this type of product shipping. So, for example, if you know that they ship plants, you know that those have to be temperature controlled and those have to be kept in certain temperatures or with certain equipment in the truck to prevent mold growing on some of them. So it's really just a matter of knowing what you need, to just knowing what they have going on, so you can go in informed and ready, and you're not just sitting there going, yeah, I'm great, you should just trust me.
And Mary, when you're really kind of getting started up with a new operation, are there any red flags that someone should be on the lookout for? Or are there any kind of telltale signs of, like, all right, I'm going to keep my eye on this and see if this kind of progresses in anything, or this is just nothing at all?
Definitely when you're using new carriers, you want to make sure that you are doing your due diligence. Like if they have a conditional safety rating or an unsatisfactory one, like obviously that's pretty apparent red flag. If you're going through their carrier 11411 and you see any sort of mention or even their Google listing, any sort of mention that they've double brokered something, immediate red flag. Those are some of the big red flags that, I mean, everyone should probably be following, but some of the less common ones would really just kind of be any reviews you get about this carrier, anything that you read about them. I mean, obviously take it with a grain of salt because we all know everyone loves to complain on carrier 411. So take it with a grain of salt. But also the important thing is to remember that you want to make sure that you're doing business with someone that is beneficial for you, your customer, and your company. So if there's someone that doesn't necessarily fit your, guidelines, then maybe don't use them, even if they are available. If there's someone that might be a little bit more expensive but more closely matches your, preferred metrics for carriers, maybe think about spending a little bit more for that quality that you're going to get.
Sometimes you have to be trusting, right? And maybe give people a little bit of grace and a little bit of chance. Where do you think that the line kind of sits with things that are non-negotiable red flags versus maybe there was a mistake made and you want to give someone the benefit of the doubt, give them a chance to fix it? Because I think most people in the industry and carriers they don't make mistakes for nefarious reasons, right? They're not like intentionally bad. It's just something that happened and maybe stayed on their record. So where do you kind of draw that line between, this is an acceptable mistake and this is something that I absolutely cannot have?
So that's something that ideally you would have corporate or company policies in place for, some of those gray areas or some of those mistakes that aren't really like a true mistake. Like if someone's like, this person didn't call me while they were supposed to or whatever, like if they just were poor communicators, but the shipment got there on time, intact, with no issues, then, okay, obviously that person's not the end of the world. It's just, they didn't live up to that one particular person's standards. So I would definitely say, obviously, the super illegal part of like double brokering is going to be a big red flag. But anything else, it's just really, you should in theory have pretty well defined policies and procedures in place of what to do when you have that kind of, they're fine otherwise from like a few complaints here and there. You also kind of know when it's worth it to take a leap and when it's not. If you start seeing like a bunch of little red flags pop up, then maybe run the other way, but it's only like one or two and otherwise everything's been fine. And also don't ever underestimate the power of a Google listing. The number one thing everybody goes to the Google listing for is to complain. So if they have good ratings there and they're not super complained on, then they're probably going to be a pretty good carrier.
And Mary, do you ever take any kind of timeline into account of saying like, hey, you know what? There were some really kind of off reports on this carrier, but they've really been kind of clear for like the last 6 to 8 months. Maybe they have corrected themselves, or do you just really kind of just put them on the no list for now just because there's just so many options out there?
I would say anything from the last 6 months indicates substantial change. So if you see something from 2 years ago that this carrier was just garbage, but everything from the last 6 months is fine, I would say go ahead and take a chance on them because typically you want good, like 6 months of good data. And so if maybe they just had like a poor dispatcher or they just were having some problems internally that they got worked out, I would just say that, obviously like you'll know, like when you're sitting there reading through everything, you're going to know what's real and what's just a load of not real. So definitely just make sure that you've done your due diligence working with new carriers and, just make sure that you put yourself in a position to be successful because the last thing you want is to take a chance on a new carrier and then they end up disappearing, holding your load hostage, trying to charge you for more money or, all of the headaches that come with some unsavory characters.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to places to complain, obviously there's a lot of them because people get their frustrations out sometimes by venting, and it's much easier to say negative things than it is to say positive things. But what about finding those positive nuggets? We know that places like Carrier 411 are a good place to find the negative reviews, but is there a good place out there to find the good things, the positives, or is that more of a word of mouth kind of thing?
Well, obviously you're going to have your word of mouth stuff, and then you're also going to have I mean, you could rely on a Google listing, but there actually are some very specific platforms that exist strictly for carrier reviews. One of them would be Carrier Source. We actually have them on the show today, and they kind of act as like a Yelp for carriers. So the good and the bad get put on there, and they said that an overwhelming majority of the reviews that they get for carriers are positive. And they just, the same way that you would tell your Chick-fil-A person that they did a great job, or that you would go out of your way to say like, oh, this person was really great, gave me great customer service today. They have that for carriers. So there are places where you can get good reviews for your carriers. It's just a matter of going out and finding them and doing that due diligence to make sure that you find the good and the bad. But you're right, Kaylee, the bad is much easier to find.
And speaking of Carrier 411, when should you kind of take some of those reports with a grain of salt, and when should you really kind of just say, all right, this is going to be completely legit? Is there any telltale signs of like saying, hey, this person is just a scorned individual and maybe this isn't the best feedback for everybody?
I would say definitely anything that is typed in all capital letters is going to be a red flag immediately. And that should just be taken with a grain of salt because, everyone gets really angry. And I would say that the more details if they were just like, this is a bad carrier, nobody should use them, I would maybe take that with a grain of salt. But if they have very specific details, and this goes the same for when you're writing your Carrier 411 reports or any kind of reviews for a carrier, the more specific you can be, the better. So if you know that this carrier is a good carrier but not great at tracking or doing anything like that, I'm so sorry, there's a giant plane outside. If you know that, this carrier is not great at tracking but gets your stuff there on time, then you know that that's not a bad carrier, they're just bad at communication. But on the other hand, if you know that this carrier is great at communication but will take an extra day or two to get your load delivered, that's fine. Go ahead and tell people those details because they're going to need to know that as well. It's basically just how much detail you can give is going to help someone from having this problem in the future versus if you yourself are reading those reviews, obviously if there's less details, maybe, take that with a grain of salt because that's how a carrier is going to, that's how you're going to know that person is probably just mad or filed a report, just on impulse and anger.
Absolutely. Great advice there, Mary. Thank you so much for joining us today. Of course, we can catch Check Call later on this afternoon. Safe travels, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to head on over to the wall for our next carrier update.
Welcome into this carrier update. Donnie, you gonna touch on what we're seeing in the rate department. Obviously, spot rates ex fuel have moved lower since the beginning of the year, which isn't really a surprise.
So let's back up. Rejection rates have dropped below 4% for drive-in. There's a couple of reasons. Number one is we know demand has softened. When demand is softened, these guys are putting their freight on auto accept. Number two, diesel fuel prices are sky high. We just looked at diesel fuel prices. Well, if they back into their contracted rates, they get a fuel surcharge. It's somewhere around 65, 70 cents per mile right now for the diesel fuel surcharge since diesel's at $4.64 per gallon right now. Well, there's another thing that's going on as well, and that's that reduction in spot rates. That's what I want to kind of show you here. So the average spot rate, and if we take out that fuel surcharge out of the spot rate, we're at 191. Well, finishing up, now there's a 2-week lag. Reefer's at 230, drive-ins at 267. So there's almost a 70 cent, there's a little bit over a 70 cent difference here in your spot rate versus your contracted rate. And you get fuel on top of this. But anyways, comparing no fuel and no fuel, there's a 70 cent difference. So if spot rates came up 40, 50 cents, you would see some movement probably in rejection rates, but not a lot. Because they're going to still do a lot better accepting their contracted freight. So this alone here is also going to keep your rejection rates down.
Yeah, I mean, that the reaction to in rejection rates would be a quick one, right? Because it's just things shifted so fast that it's like we can't adjust. Whereas if it was a more steady decline, that's where you may not see that same reaction.
We say, when spot rates are below 4%, it's telling us that spot rates are below contracted. That 4 to 7% range was contract or spot rates even with contract. Well, we got a long ways to go before that happens. So we're going to be below that 3, 4, or 4% mark for probably quite some time until we start to rebound in the spot market. And that's going to take a lot for the spot market to change right now. Looking at your PPI, that was at 35, I believe. It shows that shippers are well in control. For spot rates to pick back up, all that needs to start to change. So we need capacity to tighten up. And even though capacity starts to tighten, the carriers have got to realize that and start pushing their spot rates up and putting upward pressure, and then it'll start to flip over and turn around.
Yeah, one of the reasons that PPI's at 35 and hasn't dropped here, well, one, rates have held up, spot rates especially have held up okay, and demand is probably stronger than anticipated for this time and relatively stable as a whole. When you're looking at van, reefer all together, it's been it's held up a little bit.
We did expect it to drop a little bit more aggressively after, really after Christmas. We know that in this, in the contract market, your stuff is delivered all before right around the Thanksgiving, and then after Thanksgiving, it's just resupply. Now, spot market can pick up normally after Thanksgiving because there's some people that are behind and they're willing to pay that higher price for that on-time, on-demand capacity. Well, we didn't have that this year because the demand wasn't strong enough for that. So we didn't see spot rates pick back up. But keep an eye on this. I expect contract rates to continue to drop, and we need to keep an eye on this throughout November or January. We're going to probably see spot rates dip some, but how far is a good question.
Yep. Thank you, Donnie, for this update. We'll be sure to check in with you again a little later. Right now, we'll hand it over to Isaiah Buchanan with a look at today's social roundabout.
Welcome into Social Roundabout, everyone. I'm Isaiah Buchanan. And New York drivers, you need to be on alert. Starting today, the New York police are going to be participating in a speed initiative, trying to make sure that people watch their speeds on the roads. It's going to be taking place on Highway 20, which is a very heavily traveled road. So they're going to be cops in their normal cop cars, also the undercover cars. So just make sure that you're watching those speed limits, making sure you're not going too much above, make sure you avoid getting that ticket. Now, what's the opposite of speeding? Maybe sitting in traffic? Well, say you're stuck in traffic and you're hungry. What do? If you're a trucker, you have the opportunity to do this. Take a look at this video.
Don't understand.
I, for one, am a big fan of that and probably would do something very similar if I had the capability of doing so in my car. Now, switching things over to Netflix, the trending topic on Netflix this morning was Netflix fix your mistake or correct your mistake. So Netflix always comes out with a lot of shows every year, and there are a lot of shows that get canceled after probably just one season. And so one of their more popular shows that has come out recently is called Warrior Nun, and now the trend Netflix Correct Your Mistake is coming after the Netflix show Warrior Nun was canceled. So a lot of people, it has over 150,000 tweets so far, and it's probably still going to continue to grow because Warrior Nun was a very popular show. Now, I know one of the shows that I loved that was canceled after one season was The Society. It's basically a modern day Lord of the Flies, and I really enjoyed that show, and it got canceled on me. So Netflix, correct your mistake. That's all I have for this edition of the Social Roundabout, but right now we're going to take a look at the last 24 hours in freight with our market update.
Coming to an event like F3, we know what they want is a chance to show off their products, their swag, and make new partnerships that will last until our next FreightWaves event.
But the problem is there are so many industry events, it can be so hard to find the right one to invest your time and energy in. We at FreightWaves take your investment seriously.
Which is why we've brought together thousands of industry professionals in one city over 3 days to showcase all you have to offer.
Because your successful connections at an event like F3 move all of us forward.
Don't believe us?
Join us in June.
Welcome back to FreightWaves Now for our 10 a.m. hour. We've got a full report of headlines for this morning. A group of Teamsters representatives is asking UPS to make Martin Luther King Day a paid holiday and not require any unionized employee to work on that date. The Teamsters United group said that if the Postal Service can respect the holiday, UPS should be able to as well. In a statement responding to the Teamsters, UPS said that it supports its employees using their paid time off on a personal preference basis, including taking days for an employee to honor the dates most important to them. The labor group is using this as a jumping off point for changes in its contract for this year. Following the Transportation Research Board annual meeting, more analysts are saying that collaboration is key to railroad success. Rail industrial park development is a big topic for infrastructure investors, according to Deloitte Canada, which would serve as a way to consolidate activity between transportation modes and distribution occurring through each individual mode further inland. One example is a planned major logistics hub in Alliance, Texas, which would have access to Union Pacific and BNSF lines, as well as Fort Worth Alliance Airport, an Amazon Regional Air Hub, a FedEx Southwest Sort Hub, and a UPS Ground Sort Hub. Port Laredo was the second most used port of entry among the nation's 455 international gateways for trade in November, following Chicago O'Hare Airport. Trade at Laredo increased almost 14% year over year to $24.6 billion, but was down 8% when compared to October. Imports from Mexico to the United States accounted for $15 billion in trade through Laredo, while exports accounted for $9.6 billion. Auto parts, passenger vehicles, and heavy-duty trucks were the top three imports, and auto parts, gasoline, and diesel were the top three exports. Nikola has filed a layoff notice for up to 400 former Romeo Power battery plant workers. The company said that it would close down the practically brand new plant in Cypress, California, and move the work to Nikola's own assembly plant in Coolidge, Arizona. Nikola purchased Romeo back in August for $144 million all cash or all stock, but the softening economy has not been kind to Nikola's financials. Currently, all employees remain on Nikola's payroll, but that could change. And Nikola laid off about 100 of its own employees back in the fourth quarter of last year. The U.S. Small Business Administration has responded to the proposed Federal Railroad Administration rule that would require at least 2 crew members in a freight locomotive cab. The SBA says that the rule significantly understates the cost and the number of affected small businesses. SBA's Office of Advocacy is asking the FRA to revise and republish its initial flexibility analysis, saying that the rule should be flexed to minimize costs to small businesses. Short-line railroads typically have used one-person crews to drive, and they say that the cost of adding extra crew members at those short lines could put them out of business. And you can find these stories and more on FreightWaves.com and our FreightWaves app. And if you're watching us on YouTube, give us a like and subscribe to stay updated. Head on over to tv.freightwaves.com to find all your FreightWaves content on demand. Right now, we're going to toss things back over to the wall for our next carrier update.
Welcome into this carrier update. And Donnie, we've talked about this chart a lot recently, mainly because the holidays caused a spike in tender lead times. But we've talked about if you see an increase in tender lead times, shippers are feeling a little bit of pressure. And what we're seeing is after the holiday, they corrected, but now they're back on the rise.
Yeah, so, and this is more likely because this was a 3-day weekend to many, many people. Now that MLK has become a federal holiday, there's a lot of people that observed it for Monday and took those days off. In logistics, it's not observed as like the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, or Christmas. So there are a lot of shippers that are closed, a lot of receivers that are closed, but there's a lot of trucks that are still running. So it has pushed up the outbound tender lead time to about 2.6 days. So something to keep an eye on. We should see this start dropping down this week. If we don't, then there's something else that we need to be watching out for and understand why are shippers under pressure. Is it a capacity issue? And that's when we should turn back around and we start seeing spot rates start pushing back up. So always keep an eye out on this outbound tender lead time, and also compare the markets that you work in to the VOTLT.USA for the national average to see if it's how different it is. All right, next chart here. We'll keep moving along here. Looking at V-haul versus freight volumes. They slip up there. Now, looking at the head haul index, it shows us which markets have more freight versus trucks or more trucks versus freight. The markets that are in red have more trucks than outbound freight. So those are underbooked. The markets that are in blue have more freight than they do trucks. So we're going to say those markets are overbooked. So here at FreightWaves, you say run to the blue. Why? If you need to keep your trucks moving, you're going to have a better chance of getting this freight, especially if you have to use the spot market, by going to these markets that are in blue that have excess freight in those markets. Are they going to pay a higher price? Maybe, maybe not. They didn't want to say anything about price, but at least let you know what's going on, what market's going to be the best markets to get freight in. If you land in a red market, your truck may be sitting for a day or two. Now's the time that carriers really need to keep in mind of keeping their drivers moving and keeping them getting paid.
For sure, and I think that's the key in this. This isn't, like you said, it's not a way to gauge what's going on price-wise. It's hey, I know I can get loaded in this particular market, and going into another market, hey, it does kind of affect that pricing strategy, right? Because if you're picking up a load in Dallas and say it's going to Denver, well, you know you got to make the money on the front end because you're just going to want to get out. Whereas, hey, you're going Dallas up to Omaha, well, you may still want to do that, but the odds of you getting booked in Omaha appear on the surface a little better than what.
And that's a good point. When you're going blue to red, you know that you're going into a market that's could be a very bad market, and you can do that as long as you price appropriately for it. So if you're going, Dallas into North Carolina here, well, you may need a deadhead either up to Virginia, which is a small, not a lot of volume, or down into South Carolina or Atlanta, and need a price for that. So you can use this to help in your pricing, especially going that blue to red.
Absolutely. Well, Donnie, thank you so much for this update. We'll be sure to check in with you one more time before the end of the show. Right now, we'll hand it back over to Kaylee and Anthony.
All right, guys, thank you for that carrier update. Right now, we're going to welcome in our Washington correspondent, John Gallagher, to talk a little bit about what the new Congress is looking at as far as legislation goes that could impact the freight space. John, thank you for being here with us today. And Congress already looking at a pretty long laundry list of legislation that could potentially have impacts for us here in freight.
Yeah, Kayla, that's right. Could be, and it's a new Congress too. There's a divided Congress now that with the Republicans taking control of the House. So there's that concern that, little, if anything, might get done over the next 2 years. I've heard that in a couple of conferences and panels that I was at so far this year, and there seems to be a lot of that concern going on here in DC. But as far as freight is concerned, issues affecting freight and supply chains, a lot of times it tends to be more bipartisan. So there's that could maybe that gridlock might not be as pertinent on the freight side. But in terms of legislation, last year, just kind of general here, we had the infrastructure bill that was a huge. It's been a huge issue over the last couple of years in getting that done. But once it got into effect last year, before the power switch over, there was this pushback from the Republicans in both the House and the Senate, actually, when the infrastructure bill came up, and in terms of how the rollout's going. And because they were concerned that there was too much focus on urban transit and non-freight type stuff, and too much emphasis on requiring that these projects that come up for bid, the applications, make them go through a lot of environmental and social welfare hurdles, and that there was concern that those projects would get priority, because it wasn't explicitly in the law that you had to give all that focus, or at least how much. So now with at least on the House side, with the Republicans in charge, there's been talk that there's going to be these hearings are going to come up in the House Infrastructure Committee, that there's going to be a push to kind of reorganize priorities to more like rural and freight related type projects. That at least that's been sort of the I guess, quote unquote threat that they've been talking about if they were to take control. But in terms of, again, going back to the new Congress and freight specifically, so with the new Congress, you have to reintroduce any bills that didn't move through have to now be reintroduced. So we already saw last week the reintroduction of a bill in terms of 18 and 20-year-old drivers being able to move freight from the ports to within the state. Say in California right now, you can't move if you're 18 or 20. If you're under 21, you can't. The freight that moves from a port to a distribution center in California is considered interstate, so they don't have any ability to move that. So that bill's already been reintroduced. Then of course you have the truck parking bill that's going to be introduced, and there's in terms of owner operator type legislation, you had the overtime bill that OOIDA was pushing. You had actually at the very end of last year, the quote unquote bathroom bill to require shippers to give truckers more access to bathrooms. That's going to be reintroduced. Truck size and weight, which wasn't big last year, I understand is going to be some of the shipper groups are going to be pushing for that because it's more efficient and relative and could be cheaper for them. And then so on the regulatory side, there's, as we know, there have been several petitions that went through last year that are now in the comment period, or the comment period ended. And we're going to see if there's actually going to be a movement on those, like the electronic IDs, speed limiters, broker fraud, and one other thing that's regulatory petition that's been sort of highly anticipated from the FMCSA that's been pushed back for the last 3 or 4 years ago has to do with autonomous driving regulations, and that was supposed to come out in January. That was on the official DOT schedule for January. That's likely not going to happen, but it's probably going to be happening. Maybe after Congress has some hearings on the issue and they get their kind of they're up to speed. Congress gets more up to speed on these autonomous driving regulations, so we can see that too coming out maybe maybe by midsummer. By midsummer, if it doesn't come out sooner than that.
John, you mentioned that the bills that were introduced and haven't moved will now have to be reintroduced and re-talked about because it's a new Congress. But how many of these bills exist with language that is now out of date because they were introduced in either 2020 or 2021, even last year at a time where the freight markets and the way that the freight space is right now is vastly different, right? They've got language that might be out of date, thinking specifically of this bill to talk about the underage, or I'd say underage, but the younger truckers. The language in it cites, we have to relieve the port congestion and get goods going, but we have no port congestion anymore, right? So are we going to be playing kind of like this catch-up game, trying to reintroduce this legislation for a freight market that is just vastly different?
Yeah, I saw that too. That was, and that bill was, the language was exactly the same. So it looked kind of weird having, the ports cleared up, and yet you're saying, let's get these supply chain issues fixed. Most of the time, a lot of times they do that though. They just reintroduce the bill with the exact same language. Now, in that issue, you're right. It was a specific supply chain problem that was going on, and that's been changed. But some of these other bills have been ongoing and systemic for the last few years. And while I have to reintroduce them, that's not necessarily a bad thing because that's how these bills gain momentum. It's not all the time. I mean, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act was a bit of an exception where that was a bill that was introduced and went through on its own, relatively quickly. To deal with it, the Democrats mostly. Well, no, it was very bipartisan actually. They, it was one of those issues that everyone was talking about, supply chain disruption. So it had the ability to go through with these reforms, and a lot of that was because it had to do with foreign shipping companies. So everyone sort of rallied around against anti-China stuff. So, but that was an exception. But we'll see these bills do gain momentum, and for the truck parking bill in particular, that already it passed the House and it's in the Senate, sort of waiting to move. So that actually this could be the year for actual having a truck parking legislation where you get grant funding specifically targeted at expanding truck parking capacity.
John, it'll be very interesting to see what will happen, if anything, over the next 2 years. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we look forward to checking in with you as these continue to develop.
Sounds good. Thanks, you guys.
Right now, we're going to head back over to the wall because we have Kaylee Nix back with our next weather update.
Anthony, thank you for that. We talked a little bit earlier about how we've got that next winter storm setting up across the southern Rockies right now, moving up into the central parts of the plains. But the southern plains going to see impacts on the warm side of the storm with strong winds and another look at fire danger across western Texas specifically. So let's check it out in Sonar Critical Events right now. We do have some fire weather watches up across pretty much the entirety of West Texas. That does include just to the south of Amarillo, Lubbock, that I-20 corridor, out towards the Fort Worth area, and then down through I-10 along Fort Stockton into San Angelo and even down in just outside of San Antonio. So with this, we're going to be expecting pretty dry conditions out there and those strong winds on the front side of that winter weather. And we're going to be seeing wind gusts of about 55 to 60 miles an hour, sustained winds some places by about 35 to 40. So because of that, we also have high wind watches in place right along that I-10, I-20 split. So any drivers moving east to west through there should be pretty cautious with those strong winds today and into tomorrow. That fire weather going to continue because it will stay pretty warm ahead of this next cold front moving through, but that's just going to be today into this afternoon before that drops off tomorrow as that colder air pushes on through. Ahead of that, the next 2 days, we're looking at a severe weather threat across the deep south, the Mississippi River Valley, all the way from the southwestern corner of Kentucky through western Tennessee. That does include Memphis, and then into Jackson in Louisiana. Again, this is going to be pretty similar to that severe weather that we saw last week, where you see some multiple rounds of showers and thunderstorms, eventually ending up with one significant line of thunderstorms moving through. Details are a little bit shady on this still because we're about 2 days out, but As always, anticipating a slight tornado threat, but main problem is going to be those strong straight line winds as well as some really heavy rainfall. Last week, severe weather did impact a lot of people across the Deep South. Unfortunately, there were 7 fatalities across Alabama. So as we start to see this next setup begin, make sure that you're starting to have a plan in place to take action if you need to during severe weather, and you've got multiple ways to get your severe weather warnings, whether that's on a radio or listening to your local broadcast stations. We'll have one more look at the weather before we're done here for the day. Right now, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with today's Research Corner.
The 2023 Freight Tech 25 list is filled with meaningful innovators from across the industry who are helping shape what the future of supply chain will look like. Check out the full list of these companies and all the latest freight tech news at FreightWaves.com.
What does this have to do with freight? Well, I'm glad you asked. People are wondering what's going to happen with inflation. Is there going to be hyperinflation? When is hyperinflation going to be here? When is there going to be inflation? What's going to happen with inflation? Inflation.
This is the sexiest topic within the economy right now.
Welcome to Drilling Deep. I'm your host, John Kingston. Drilling Deep is the place where we talk about oil and we talk about diesel, and you have to drill to get oil and you have to get oil to make diesel, so that's why we call it Drilling Deep. Drilling Deep drops every Friday on FreightWaves TV and all available podcast platforms.
Welcome into this week's edition of the Research Corner. I'm Tony Mulvey, and this week's episode's or segment's going to really be highlighted around the macro economy. So, what better person to bring on than our chief economist, Anthony Smith? Anthony, how are you doing?
Tony, I'm doing well, and thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, I know. I think you've been on Research Corner before. Definitely been on the spot. We've done plenty of things together, but this one's really interesting because tomorrow we get obviously retail sales and the producer price index. Last week we got the consumer price index, which obviously we saw some relief, if we want to put it that way, relief from in that. But other macro signs are kind of signaling these more like yellow, orangish lights, right? They're not yellow, but they're not quite red yet. But we have a chart here. One of my favorites. It's our total revolving credit outstanding. So, consumer credit cards, those shorter-term loans that, as it entails, revolving, taking out kind of the mortgages, those long-term loans. We see this just drastic increase in the amount of credit outstanding. So, this is a signal consumers are taking on debt into the terms of what, $1.19 trillion. And I think the concerning part to me is if you look over by where you are, we're on this trend line up. And I think that's normal. You see when COVID happens, stimulus packages, stay-at-home savings, we were able to pay off a lot of debt. Then, March of 2021, there was this it was kind of the same time frame things really started to open up. Maybe not fully, but you really started to see the spending really intensify. And then from there, we've just seen an explosion in this credit. I mean, you look at this chart, how concerning is it that we really haven't seen it slow down, like this increase slowed down in any way?
Yeah, it's very concerning, especially when you start to take into other factors as well. So we have this, of course, revolving credit card utilization, which is having just an absolute run up right now. The other big concerning thing is that the savings rate is at the lowest level that we've seen in well over a decade. It ticked up, I think, 0.02 points or 0.2 points in the latest release, but it's still at lows that we haven't seen in well over or right around 15 years or so. So we're still seeing that the savings rate is at a very low rate, and so that mixed with the heavy utilization of credit cards makes for some very concerning trends. The big saving grace right now that everyone's pointing to is definitely going to be the jobs market, but that is, of course, a lagging indicator and a segment that can have sudden shifts. We've seen the job market flip on a dime. We've seen complete shutdown in jobs, large amounts of layoffs, even though we're hearing of layoffs right now. I don't think we've even seen the worst of them just yet on a macro scale. The big thing, we're looking at job openings. It's great, but the types of jobs aren't the best of quality. And then on the other side, when we look at the hirings have really been falling for, I think, over 80% of the releases over the last year. So there is definitely some concern there.
Yeah, and I think that one of the concerns I have, right, the Fed's been in this hawkish taking the hawkish approach to curb inflation by raising interest rates. The concern I think I have is that the rising rates aren't fully felt by the consumer yet. And I think when you take on debt and the cost of the debt is also rising, where your savings rate is now, like you said, the lowest level it's been, I think it was 2005, and then before then, that was the lowest it had ever been since it had been founded or brought to light in like the 1960s. So, I mean, we're talking about historic lows in terms of what consumers have in savings. We'll bring up one of the charts that I like to look at. It's the CPI. Obviously, we can talk about this one for a while because there's so much nuance with the CPI. We saw it tick down, signaling prices actually fell. Whereas before we talked about inflation falling, well, it's not that it's not falling, it's just not rising as fast as it was. This was a month where we saw an actual decline. But we have here in the blue line, the CPI for gas. And really, if you look at the whole CPI, energy prices were one of the big drivers, but you also saw used vehicle motor parts decline. So, I mean, you're seeing this overall decline stemming from two things that have risen arguably the fastest out of anything over the past 2 years.
Yes, exactly right. And we do know, of course, that energy is definitely another one that can have a sudden shock and sudden rises. And the used cars ones definitely makes a lot of sense when looking at those ongoing raises and interest rates. This is going to be one of those big ticket items that definitely gets hampered, and definitely, as you mentioned earlier, one of the areas that had one of the most meteoric rises as we've kind of moved throughout the last couple of years here. And that's going to be a big thing here because we're looking at the core inflation and all these other factors. It's still very much high, it's still very much active, and it makes all the sense in the world when I look at why Jerome Powell and the Fed is really kind of looking hard at raising these rates, because we don't have many other tools right now, and I think they have to get this as high as they can, as fast as they can, because in economic downturn, in a recession that everyone's going to agree on, whenever that does happen, this is going to be one of the tools that they have to use, and bringing it down and starting to kind of churn out some monetary policy is going to be inflationary building. The other big aspect that now a lot of folks are talking about, including the credit card utilization, is going to be the buy now, pay later programs that are just like this black hole that hasn't been tracked very closely. And also on top of that, the US dollar, which has been strong for like the last few years here, a downward movement in that US dollar could start to really mean inflationary pressures building for imports and really being able to import goods from other countries. And so there's so many aspects going into play right now. Looking at replenishing inventory levels depends on if we can get those inventories from China, because nearshoring and reshoring isn't going to happen overnight. So there are just so many variables at play right now.
Absolutely. I think it's funny. You mentioned core inflation, right? It excludes food, and food prices are one of the things that are rising. I mean, look, and it's been talked about, and I see it all over social media, is the price of eggs. Right. And I think that's the thing to remember is like they're in core inflation, you're taking out two of the things that are necessities, right? Food and energy. Those are two necessities for humans. And I mean, so something to pay attention to. We'll move on here to our next chart. We'll bring up Bank of America's credit card spending data. I like looking at this because it gives kind of a retail sales, we talk about it. It comes out tomorrow, right, for December. Well, this is data that, yes, it's important, but what did spending do in December? We can kind of get at least a gauge on that. We saw a little uptick, right, here in the green line, right there into the end of the year. Not really surprised, and you're seeing results of that in the freight data by volumes snap back a little better, rates held up a little stronger than maybe expected, spending held up better than it did in previous years. But does that trend continue? I think that's going to be the key to pay attention to as we move forward.
Definitely, and really being able to interpret this one correctly is going to be interesting, because if we see just like this blockbuster retail sales report, is that really a good sign? Because do we really want to see consumers spending more? Or if we start to see a sharp downturn in retail sales, is that a good sign because we're going to see consumers starting to save money? So the interpretation of this one, of all the details that we're going to get, is going to be very interesting to see what the breakdowns are in this upcoming release.
Absolutely. Well, Anthony, thank you so much for joining me on this week's edition of the Research Corner. Right now, we'll take a quick break, but we'll be back with more FreightWaves Now.
The 2023 Freight Tech 25 list is filled with meaningful innovators from across the industry who are helping shape what the future of supply chain will look like. Check out the full list of these companies and all the latest freight tech news at FreightWaves.com.
What does this have to do with freight? Well, I'm glad you asked. People are wondering what's going to happen with inflation. Is there going to be hyperinflation? When is hyperinflation going to be here? When is there going to be inflation? What's going to happen with inflation? Inflation.
This is the sexiest topic within the economy right now.
Welcome to Drilling Deep. I'm your host, John Kingston. Drilling Deep is the place where we talk about oil and we talk about diesel, and you have to drill to get oil and you have to get oil to make diesel, so that's why we call it Drilling Deep. Drilling Deep drops every Friday on FreightWaves TV and all available podcast platforms.
And welcome back to FreightWaves Now. It's time for our final check of the weather this morning. And we're looking at that next storm system setting up across central parts of the United States. But ahead of that, we're going to be watching some lingering rainfall and then even some heavy rain for the mid-Atlantic. So let's check it out in Sonar Critical Events. Right now here in Freight Alley, we've got some light rain falling, and we can expect these light showers throughout the rest of the day, and that heaviest rain is going to be centered along the middle parts of the Atlantic coast, even up into the start of New England. So we do have some heavy rain going on across Carolina into Virginia and then up to Maryland, Delaware. Some of this is on that rain-snow line moving towards New Jersey and New York, and then up to central New York. We do have some snowfall going on that's quick hitting, but because of that, there are winter weather advisories in place. Further back behind that, we've got more snow coming for the central and southern Rockies, as where that is going to be the main winter storm setting up that will move through the area tomorrow on into the middle parts and the end of your week. We've got winter storm warnings in place for the southwestern corner of Colorado and winter weather advisories along for that I-70 corridor in Colorado there. Basically, we've got some light snowfall moving through, quick hitting, and then heavier snow setting up on the backside of that. So even down into central Arizona and New Mexico along that I-40 corridor, there is some heavier snowfall going on. Because of that, we've got winter storm warnings in effect and then winter weather advisories in effect for New Mexico. That does include the I-40 corridor on the western half of the state, moving through the Gallup and Grants area and then up into the I-25 corridor through Santa Fe with winter weather warnings and then winter weather advisories in place. Total snowfall amounts will really be varied for this snowstorm moving through right now, but we could anticipate pretty much anywhere from about a dusting to an inch all the way up to 6 to 8 inches in some spots. So just really going to depend on where you're at, and we're going to keep watching it as we move throughout the rest of the week. We're going to toss things back over to Isaiah. He's got a final check of our social roundabout this morning.
Welcome into Social Roundabout, everyone. I'm Isaiah Buchanan. And New York drivers, you need to be on high alert because starting today, the New York police are going to be patrolling the Highway 20 section of in New York to watch out for potential speeders. So if you're on that Highway 20 section in New York, then you need to just be careful, be on the lookout for any, make sure you're driving the speed limit. There's going to be cops in their patrol cars, and there's also going to be undercover cops as well. So just make sure that you're being careful, driving the speed limit to avoid making sure that you don't get a ticket. Now, switching things up a little bit, what's the opposite of speeding? Maybe sitting in traffic? Well, maybe when you are sitting in traffic and you are hungry, if you're a driver, you have the opportunity to do this. Take a look at this TikTok video. You think if I could find a skillet like that that could plug into my cigarette lighter that it would work? Find out on the next episode of Social Roundabout. Finally, we're gonna wrap things up talking about Netflix. They have a new trend, or I guess you can call it hashtag whatever trend. So it's called Netflix Correct Your Mistake. So one of Netflix's more popular recent shows is Warrior Nun. And as you can see, and this is a clip from the show Warrior Nun where one of the characters is punching quote unquote Netflix. So the whole premise of this is that Netflix has canceled Warrior Nun, and they've canceled a lot of shows that are really popular that people like that only get maybe 1, maybe 2 seasons. So this tweet has, I said 150,000 earlier, it's now up to about 158,000 people who have tweeted about Netflix correcting their mistake. I know that I have a favorite show, it's called The Society. It was basically a modern day Lord of the Flies. It came out several years ago and Netflix canceled it after 1 season. So Netflix, I need you to correct your mistake. That's all I have for this edition of the Social Roundabout, but right now I'm gonna toss things over to our roundtable talk.
Right, Isaiah, thank you for that. It's time now for our roundtable on this Tuesday, and I'm sat between 2 of the smartest people in the room, which is a good place to be, between Zach Strickland, our freight market expert, and Thomas Wasson, our enterprise trucking expert. And guys, I think that there's no shortage of disruptions that could go on in 2023 when it comes to the freight industry. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Obviously, we're just about half of a month into the year and nothing's happened yet, but we're waiting with kind of bated breath, right? So let's dig into it a little bit. Zach, when you're looking at the upcoming year, what's the biggest opportunity for chaos we could see for the freight industry?
Yeah, I think we're already starting to see the opportunity for chaos. So we're coming out of an overheated environment. So what that means is that we've literally, like, if you've had a piece of coal sitting on a fire and you just took a leaf blower to it and just started blowing on it as hard as you could. That's what we had for the last year and a half, 2 years, ending in about March of last year. And we're still seeing the fallout from all of that overheating action. So inventory levels correcting, et cetera. I think everybody's expecting that to normalize this year. However, I think a lot of these analysts that I've read are discounting the overriding macroeconomic trend of consumer demand eroding. One of the things that consumers have been trained to do now is spend their way through things, especially in America. Anthony Smith talks about it all the time. And I think they're going to wake up one day and all of a sudden look at their account and go, whoops, the credit card's not, the credit card bill is a little bit higher than I expected it to be, et cetera. And I think that with all of this expansion of infrastructure that we saw during towards the tail end of the pandemic era, it's going to start to have another layer of hangover effect on the rest of the supply chain.
Absolutely. So at the end of last year, we were all kind of tasked with putting together our predictions for this year, right? And I think a pretty decent handful of us said, we can expect the general macro environment and the changing ways that consumers are interacting, plus the overstock of inventory, to really push maybe some major carriers to the edge of bankruptcy. That was something that I think was a bold prediction, but really not that bold, right, from a lot of us. Thomas, what do you think about that? Could we be seeing maybe a shakeup in the major carriers who are existing, or what they're capable of doing in the landscape?
Well, I definitely think so. We're traditionally, if you're a large trucking publicly traded company, you either go pure play and you keep getting more trucks, which is a problem because as the market moves, highs and lows, so we see movements in intermodal. But I like Zach's analogy when we're talking about he was stoking in a fire. Well, I'm looking at right now, especially with a trucking cycle, it's like you're taking a curve. There's two types of people. There's the kind of people that accelerate into the curve at the end, and there's the kind of people who hit the brakes. Mergers and acquisition activities, I'm expecting to see right now, this will be the opportunity for not only truckload carriers, but brokerages to see who's the one who's going to hit the gas and not be afraid. Because that's the big question right now. Analysts are we're torn between Q1 of this year and 1H, first half of this year. There is a lot of fuzziness in terms of, will the market bottom? When are we gonna get near the edge of the curve till we can see the next straightaway? And so, I would expect to see large carriers, environment's gonna open up. Financing, those that don't have the debt load, we see a few folks re-upping on their credit facilities. Werner's re-upping on their credit lines, like $1 billion or however much on the lines. Investors are going to start expecting some kind of movement. Trucking normally gets hit the hardest up front, and it's usually the first one to come back. As soon as we start getting out of the edge of the curve, who's going to start making some deals, who's going to make some moves, and we should probably see that movement probably by March or even moving into June. So get your tickets out, and we'll see who's going to be making some moves today.
So what about the third type of people who cross over the yellow line into oncoming traffic when they take a curve? What are they looking at?
Let's hope they have good insurance. It's going to be important, and that's going to be for a few companies. Those are going to be the ones, unfortunately.
A risky business, right?
Extremely risky. Small carriers, owner-operators. We harp on it a lot being in media. We talk about the exodus of small carriers. They're really hard to really pin point. So that's going to be another agent of chaos that we're not going to be able to adequately talk about it until after it's plainly obvious, because how they fit in the data, it's really hard to find exactly what the heck they're up to. We have to approach it on the outside. Look at used truck prices. You look at all, spot rates. Look at fuel costs. Look at, tender rejection levels. So that's going to be the wild card, is going to be, are you leaving the market fast enough? Have you left the market fast enough? And who's the folks smart enough to capitalize and figure out if they have, then they're going to move in and move from there.
So speaking of data, we're kind of in this lull period where we're waiting for both fourth quarter 2022 results and full year results to come out for the majority of our companies, right? We're halfway through January, should be expecting earnings to start dropping here fairly soon. And that's going to be kind of the telltale of what does the rest of the year look like. And that's, of course, historical data going back a quarter or even the last year. So Zach, talk to us a little bit about the importance of real-time data when you're trying to prepare for possible disruptions in 2023. Obviously, knowing where you're at is like the first step, but does it balance with that historical?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in the environment we're in, you're really trying to quantify exactly what you're dealing with at the time, because that's dictating your action plan. Like if we think, for instance, that all demand is going to stabilize and normalize at this current level, that changes your game plan entirely for the next year. So especially if you're a transportation provider or a brokerage entity, you can now stabilize your, you can level set your bar for the, your budgets and your forecasts for the next months. Rates aren't going to move or change that much. You can stabilize your margins at certain levels, et cetera. So if you see, and one of the things we've seen with our data is that it hasn't had a big, strong change one direction or the other over the past several months. A lot of us, Craig Fuller just wrote an article actually saying we came out of the new year in a lot better position than a lot of us expected. And we could see that with our outbound tender volume index. Demand actually was relatively high. Now it's too soon to kind of call that, okay, this is going to be it. Maybe there was some leftover holiday activity, inventory correction, et cetera. But that's the type of thing that you're looking for if you're a day-to-day operator. But also, if you're looking into the long-run future, you want to make sure you don't miss, like in the stock market, your worst days. Because if you start operating off of a plan that's a month old and the conditions have changed that much, you're going to be the one that Thomas is talking about running into the middle of the median there without the information that you need to change your direction, because that's what it means to be flexible in a volatile environment. That's what you have to have when things are so dynamic and shifting all the time.
Right, absolutely. You've got to have the ability to either accelerate or decelerate through the curve, right? You can't just make your decision and keep it going one way. Thomas, let's talk a little bit about modes for the next year. What do you expect maybe being the mode that has the most vulnerability to any type of major impact event?
Well, traditionally you're going to look at, by the textbook, trucking is obviously the most vulnerable because of supply and demand. Ones to watch, though, are obviously going to be intermodal and container shipping, which directly correlate into eventual truckload volumes. Right now, we talked about the issues with containers, making the turn cycles a glut of containers. What's going to happen with ports that now have too many empty containers? What happens with the rail folks that are, they bought all these extra units and now they're not having enough demand, so velocity suffers. So, a lot of the trends right now, improving intermodal service, obviously, because there's less stuff being shipped, so they're going to do better by default. But $1,500 for like a TEU 20-foot equivalent unit, and it used to be 20 grand. So that's the other big thing. So looking at those two factors, trucking is still the most riskiest because it has the newest entrants. It's hard to, dominate. Intermodal and container, you have either a cartel of container lines or a cartel of rail folks. Whose tracks is it? Well, you're going to find out real quick. You can just look and see who's going across your, railroad crossing.
Absolutely. And so as we look into the year, obviously we are in this cooling macroeconomic environment. We're waiting for the consumer to catch up. Our freight markets have cooled pretty substantially. Is there a doomsday scenario that makes everything come crumbling down? Or do you think that we're okay for now?
I mean, yeah, I think if any time in history that we are set up for one of those doomsday scenarios, and I hate to be the, instilling fear and chaos, but it's now because we've had such an overheated climate. That's exactly that's what happened in the 20s. The roaring 20s were followed by the Depression. And it's because we came out of a wartime environment where we had all this spending and infrastructure building activity that was really overheated, and then kick in banks overextending. And not that it's going to happen in that exact same way, but this is the type of climate that you expect that really bad trough to dig itself out of. I mean, it's and not to say that that's going to happen. I think there's fundamentally some things in place that stabilize us more than we did in the 20s and 30s, but it doesn't mean that it can't be pretty rough.
We'll put it on the record. Zach Strickland is not an alarmist. He just thinks that there could be a doomsday catalyst. Thomas, what do you think? Are we close to a doomsday scenario, or is there something that will have to happen before it puts us into that deep, deep trough?
I would say I'm never worried about doomsday scenarios. The guy who created Dilbert, his name's Scott Adams. He has what's called the Scott Adams law of slow-moving disasters. If we know about it long enough, like German energy issues and a few other things, if we all start recognizing it, we're very surprisingly resilient. The supply chain's resilient. People are resilient. Everyday workers are, we're all doing our parts. But the surprises, if there ever was a doomsday scenario, it would be more of like a oopsie-daisy kind of surprise. Maybe a port shuts down. Maybe there's an unexpected cut for a gas line that's impacting prices. These are the things that a lot of people, when we talk about doomsday, the concern is because basically we are coming out in an environment for the past 2 years that was like, holy cow, I don't know what to do. There's a lot of uncertainty going on. I can't predict this. And now we're finally moving into something that's more business as usual. And for a lot of people who have not been around the past 5-10 years, this can be very scary. The business cycle turns and it makes people uncomfortable and they get fearful. So, honestly, no doomsday scenario for me. I can't think of anything off the top. It's really hard to break a supply chain because it's inherently chaotic and broken to begin with. So please try your best. For working in it for the past 8 years, I promise you can't mess it up more than I've at least seen a few people. I've tried my dangest and I haven't broken it yet. So
maybe. Fate, Thomas. We know something happens. It's because Thomas attempted fate.
Sorry, y'all.
All right, guys, thank you both for joining us today. Of course, you can catch Zach on Freightonomics and Thomas on Loaded and Rolling. We're going to take a final break, and we'll be right back to wrap up FreightWaves Now.
When guests come to an event like F3, we know what they want is a chance to show off their products, their swag, and make new partnerships that will last until our next FreightWaves event.
But the problem is there are so many industry events, it can be so hard to find the right one to invest your time and energy in. We at FreightWaves take your investment seriously.
Which is why we've brought together thousands of industry professionals in one city over 3 days to showcase all you have to offer.
Because your successful connections at an event like F3 move all of us forward.
Don't believe us?
Join us in June.
What does this have to do with freight? Well, I'm glad you asked. People are wondering what's going to happen with inflation. Is there going to be hyperinflation? When is hyperinflation going to be here? When is there going to be inflation? What's going to happen with inflation? Inflation.
This is the sexiest topic within the economy right now.
And welcome back to FreightWaves Now. It's time for one final check of your headlines this morning. Nikola has filed a layoff notice for up to 400 former Romeo Power battery plant workers. The company said that it would close down the practically brand new plant in Cypress, California, and move the operations to Nikola's own assembly plant in Coolidge, Arizona instead. Nikola purchased Romeo back in August for $144 million in stock, but the softening economy has not been kind to its financials. Currently, all employees remain on Nikola's payroll, but that may change. Nikola laid off about 100 of its own employees back in the fourth quarter of last year. The U.S. Small Business Administration has responded to the proposed Federal Railroad Administration rule that would require at least 2 crew members in a freight locomotive cab. The SBA says that the rule significantly understates the cost and the number of affected businesses. SBA's Office of Advocacy is asking the FRA to revise and republish its initial flexibility analysis, saying that the rule should be flexed to minimize costs to small businesses. Short-line railroads typically have used one-person crews to drive those locomotives and say that the cost of adding extra crew members at those short lines could put them out of business. And the California Trucking Association has refiled a request for a new preliminary injunction to block AB5 from affecting the state's trucking sector. CTA wrote and filed a 32-page brief with the U.S. District Court on Wednesday, saying that the law simply won't work because it is in violation of the F4A rule. The injunction was filed in front of the same judge that granted the initial injunction to the law back in 2019, before the Supreme Court denied to hear the case. And you can find those stories and more on FreightWaves.com and our FreightWaves app. If you're watching us on YouTube, give us a like and subscribe to stay updated. And of course, you can catch all of your favorite shows on tv.freightwaves.com. We're going to toss things back over to Tony and Donnie for our final carrier update.
Welcome into the final carrier update, and it's obviously that means lanes of the day, Donnie. So going to start here in the Northeast.
Yeah, we're going to start here. We didn't get into some of the all the maps that I wanted to, but we saw where Elizabeth, New Jersey had a pretty good sizable increase in volumes. Rejection rates are still going down, so I decided to pull up Elizabeth, headed out to Boston, up to Boston, Massachusetts. A lot of your freight that comes into the New Jersey, Philadelphia, PA area, normally delivering up into the Northeast because it absorbs more freight than what it actually produces. But here we saw a little bit of a pickup just after the first of the year, but it's actually already starting to
decline.
Run back down. Average rate though is still $4.55 per mile, but it's only a 230-mile run. So we're looking. It's not. It looks pretty at $4.55, but the actual entire revenue is not that great, considering you're going to have to make this entire run there and back each day. And can you do it with all that traffic? So the times are going to be difficult.
That, and this is the lane where you have to make your money going in, or so you would think. I think you'll show us the chart here.
Yeah.
It shows maybe it's still not $4.55, but it's not as bad as what it. Or not as low as what it used to be.
$1 a mile. We'll hit a little double arrows there and hit it. Boston coming back to Elizabeth. It's still at $3.72, but it is also declining. So overall, this is a pretty good run because, back in the day, they may run up for, $4 a mile, $5 a mile, and then come back at $1 a mile. So a lot better run now. You can actually make some pretty good money if you can cut this entire round trip in about a day. You want to probably leave very early in the morning, get loaded the night before, leave early in the morning, deliver, reload, and be on your way back to where you can deliver that afternoon, and then, of course, keep that cycle going.
Absolutely.
All right, next lane here, go to the next chart here. Looking at Houston. Houston also showed some nice possibilities on our head haul index. It showed that as a little bit overbooked. So I went and chose Atlanta, easy run here, 800 miles. And we see that over the past, 2 to 3 weeks, we've seen quite an increase. This used to be, a 210, 214 a mile, and it's pulled all the way up to about 244. So if you're maybe based out of Atlanta, you may want to try to maybe accept more loads into the Houston, because this is going to be your backhaul. And for a backhaul lane at 244 right now in January, still going to be a pretty good lane. Range 227 to 254. And again, 795 miles. The reason I say that is we hit a little double arrows there, and look at Atlanta going back to Houston, pulling up here. It is $2.02. So this is the lane that you want to run on contract. And then pick up that 244 and bring it back that 800 miles.
Absolutely, Donnie. Thank you so much for the updates. Right now, we'll hand the show back over to Kaylee and Anthony.
Alrighty, guys, that does it for us here today for your Tuesday edition of FreightWaves Now. We're on a short week. We've got some exciting company stuff going on this week, so we won't be back until Friday morning. But don't worry, there are plenty of shows to catch up on if you've missed some.
That's right. Coming up a little bit later, we're going to have Put That Coffee Down, and we'll also have Thomas Watson back with Loaded and Rolling, and yours truly here, Freightonomics, will be on a little bit later on at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and we will see you guys later on in the week.
And market experts. On FreightWaves.com, you can also watch the only streaming TV network dedicated to freight. FreightWaves TV provides you with coverage you won't find anywhere else. However you like your news delivered, check us out online or on the FreightWaves app.
What the truck